In the winter of 1878, a substitute teacher in Cedar Creek, Indiana, lifted a loose floorboard in the church basement and froze. What she pulled out wasn't a lesson plan. It was a ledger. And as her eyes scanned the entries, her blood turned cold. Each line was a name, an age, and a sale price. This was not a record of education. It was an inventory of children. Tonight, we uncover the truth about Cedar Creek's most protected secret. Because this isn't just a story about 50 missing children. It's a story about the people who looked at their empty beds and chose to believe a comforting lie. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. In your own community right now, what would you refuse to see? Cedar Creek sat in the heart of Indiana's coal country, where Methodist faith ran as deep as the mine shafts beneath it. By 1876, it was a bustling town of 3,000, a population large enough to hide terrible patterns, but small enough to trust blindly. The railroad had brought wealth, and with it, a desperate hunger for respectability. Your church wasn't just where you prayed, it was your social resume. And one church dominated them all. The First Methodist Church was a crown jewel of Indiana limestone, its twin bell towers calling the faithful for miles. It was a monument to progress and piety. But its grandeur served a second, darker purpose. It commanded absolute trust. To question what happened inside was to question the soul of the town itself. And in the shadow of those beautiful stained glass windows, a perfect hunting ground was being curated. At the heart of it all was Margaret Wilson. A stern, formidable woman of 42, she'd arrived from Philadelphia with impeccable references and a chilling philosophy. She believed children were like clay, meant to be reshaped by a firm hand before they hardened. Parents saw a miracle worker who could tame any unruly child. They didn't see the calculator behind her eyes, already assessing which children were valuable and which were vulnerable. Her assistant, Sarah Coleman, was the gentle counterpoint. Soft-spoken and compassionate, she had a magic touch with restless children, coaxing out their fears and dreams over whispered conversations. Parents saw a nurturing angel. They didn't realize she was the operations chief intelligence gatherer, meticulously profiling each child's weaknesses for a ledger they would never see. And overseeing it all was Robert Hayes, a wealthy businessman and the church's biggest patron. His donations funded everything. His presence wasn't just financial, it was a shield of legitimacy. Together, they formed a perfect, unholy trinity. Wilson provided the authority that demanded obedience. Coleman provided the comfort that silenced fear. And Hayes provided the money and influence that ensured no one dared to ask questions. Their weapon wasn't a knife. It was a brochure. They created legendary biblical excursions, week-long educational trips to historical sites, promised to bring scripture to life. For parents in a remote, hardscrabble town, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. It wasn't just a trip, it was a promise of escape, of a future for their child far beyond the cold dust and struggle. Mothers packed tiny suitables with trembling hands, not from fear but from overwhelming hope. They saw a sacred ticket out of poverty handed to them by God's own servants. The timing was predatory perfection. The panic of 1873 had crushed the local economy. Fathers worked fewer shifts. Dinner tables grew sparse. Futures felt negotiable. In that climate of desperation, the church's offer wasn't just attractive. It felt like divine intervention. To question it would feel like spitting in the face of God's grace. And then Margaret Wilson expanded her reach. She reached out to smaller, poorer Methodist congregations in the surrounding counties, offering to include their children in these miraculous trips. It was praised as Christian charity. It was actually strategic fragmentation. By drawing victims from a dozen different isolated towns, she made sure no single community could connect the dots. A missing child here was a blessed opportunity there. The system was now insulated by miles and misinformation. The stage was set. The mechanisms of trust, hope, and fear were all perfectly greased. The first child was selected. His bag was packed. His parents wept with joyous pride. And when he didn't come home, there was already a system in place to make sure his mother's first feeling wasn't suspicion, but shame for doubting the good people who had given him a chance. The first name in the ledger was Timothy Morrison, 8 years old. His parents were German immigrants who spoke broken English and spent their days in the suffocating dark of Robert Hayes's coal mine. In September of 1876, Margaret Wilson took them aside. She said their quiet, thoughtful boy had shown exceptional spiritual promise. A distinguished Methodist family in Kentucky, specializing in biblical archaeology, had personally requested him as a scholarly apprentice. This was an honor, she explained. A sacred opportunity. He would be educated, his path set toward the ministry or missionary work. The Morrisons, whose own world was one of backbreaking labor, wept with grateful joy. They watched him walk into the church basement that final morning, believing they were witnessing a beginning. In the ledger there was no Kentucky. His entry was a cold, clinical fact. Sturdy build. Docile. $85. Chicago textile interests. His value was not in his mind, but in his small, strong hands. The price was set. The transaction was already complete. His parents' miracle was a business arrangement, and their son was now inventory. 2 weeks later, the target was Mary Catherine Phillips. 10 years old, the capable eldest daughter of a widowed laundress. Sarah Coleman spent hours with her, praising her leadership, her kindness. She told Mary Catherine's mother that a Methodist mission in Illinois desperately needed a girl just like her to help establish Sunday schools on the frontier. It was training, they said. A sacred duty. For a woman scrubbing sheets to feed 3 children, this was not an opportunity. It was a miracle. It was divine intervention lifting her brightest child from a life of certain struggle. She packed Mary Catherine's single dress with a heart full of relief, not dread. She believed she was giving her daughter a future, when in truth she was handing her over. Mary Catherine's entry in the ledger was different. Age 10. Intelligent. Leadership qualities. $120. Louisville Domestic Services. The premium price reflected different demands. A different kind of buyer. Domestic service was a bland term for a grim market that prized girls who were pleasant, educated, and pliable. The forged letters that later arrived in Sarah Coleman's practiced hand spoke of busy days and grateful prayers, carefully crafted to smother a mother's lonely heart. By Christmas of 1876, 6 more children had vanished from the pews. A brother and sister from a large Irish family. A quiet boy from a farm drowning in debt. Each story was custom built. Each lie exploited a specific parental hope or fear. Each departure was celebrated as a community achievement. Proof of Margaret Wilson's miraculous program. The pattern was now a machine. Selection was never random. It was a cold calculation. Sarah Coleman's gentle conversations were, in fact, ruthless assessments. She identified the vulnerable. Immigrants isolated by language, widows clinging to the church, families where one less mouth was a hidden relief. Their gratitude was the insurance policy. To question the blessing was to risk losing everything. The children themselves were evaluated on a brutal spreadsheet of human worth. Younger, sturdy boys were commodities for factories and mines. Older girls were groomed for a different trade. Intelligence was a complicating factor. A brighter child might fetch more, but they were also a flight risk. The Sunday school was no longer a place of learning. It was a showroom and a testing ground. This was not a series of tragic kidnappings. It was a supply chain. And Margaret Wilson was its regional distributor. Her connections, greased by Robert Hayes's business network, now stretched into Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. Children from Cedar Creek could be moved to a factory in Chicago. A child from a compromised operation in Ohio could be absorbed here. The railroad, the symbol of progress, became the silent accomplice. The financial returns were staggering. The $85 for Timothy, the $120 for Mary Catherine. These were just entries in a column growing longer by the month. The money flowed back into Cedar Creek, funding expansions to the very church basement that hid their secrets. The crime was now funding its own perfect disguise, building a fortress of legitimacy with the profits of despair. But the true engine was not greed alone. It was documented in a private journal, hidden even deeper than the ledger. Sarah Coleman was the architect of control. Her journal contained not numbers but psychological profiles. Notes on which child feared abandonment, which thrived on praise, which could be broken by guilt. She documented her methods for severing a child from their family, from their past. She believed she was saving them from poverty, from their ordinary lives. She wasn't just selling children, she was prepping them for delivery. The community's blindness was cultivated. When a family had quiet doubts, a letter would arrive, a forgery in a child's mimicked handwriting full of cheerful details. It was a masterstroke. The proof of the lie was delivered as a comfort, dismantling a parent's instinct to worry. To question the letter was to question their own child's happiness. The lie arrived disguised as love. For 2 years, this machine operated with chilling efficiency. 50 names were added to the ledger. 50 beds grew cold. Yet in Cedar Creek, the legend only grew. The Sunday school was more popular than ever. Robert Hayes was a civic saint. Margaret Wilson was a visionary. The empty spaces were not voids, they were proof of stunning success. Look how many children we have elevated. But even the most perfect system has a weakest link. In January of 1878, that link fell ill. Sarah Coleman, the gentle spy, was diagnosed with consumption. Her sudden absence created a crisis. She was the only one who knew every child's story, every parent's pressure point. Her meticulous mind was irreplaceable. The church board moved quickly to hire a temporary replacement. They found Ellen Hartwell, 24, freshly graduated from Teachers College. She was bright, devout, and eager. She saw Cedar Creek as the pinnacle of religious education. What the conspirators saw was a harmless young woman who would follow instructions. They failed to account for one thing. Her modern training had taught her to trust systems, not smiles. She believed in records, receipts, and results. And for the first time in 2 years, the numbers were about to refuse to stay quiet. The cough that echoed through the Sunday school classroom in January of 1878 belonged to Sarah Coleman. The diagnosis was consumption, the kind of illness that removes people quietly. Her sudden absence wasn't just a staffing issue. It was a tremor in the foundation of Margaret Wilson's entire operation. Sarah was the keeper of secrets, the weaver of lies. Her meticulous mind was irreplaceable. To fill the void, the church board hired a replacement. They chose Ellen Hartwell, 24 years old, a recent graduate of the Indiana State Normal School. She arrived inspired, ready to learn from a legendary program. What they didn't realize was that modern education had taught her one dangerous habit: checking. She had been trained to trust systems, not sermons. Her first weeks presented a perfect picture. Well-behaved children, impressive facilities, overwhelming community support. But Ellen had been taught to be suspicious of perfection. Her first request was simple: to see the prior curriculum for the children who had left. She needed to understand what they had learned. Margaret Wilson dismissed her with a wave. "Those studies were specialized," she said without smiling. "Advanced. The records were private." It was the first locked door. Then Ellen tried to connect. She asked parents about their absent sons and daughters. She was met with averted eyes and mumbled replies. The pride she expected had been replaced by a strange, uniform silence. It was as if these children had not just left town, but had been erased from conversation. The community had not just accepted their absence, it had been trained to forget. Ellen began listening to the whispers in the church vestibule. She heard fragments that didn't align. A child in Philadelphia was connected to a Cincinnati mission. A family getting letters from Illinois had been told their child was in Kentucky. Each discrepancy was small. Together they were unbearable. A story this beautiful shouldn't have so many rough edges. Her confrontation with Margaret Wilson was brief. Ellen proposed writing to the host families to start a pen pal system. Wilson's reaction was instantaneous and cold. Such contact was forbidden. It would disrupt the children's immersion. Ellen was to cease all inquiries. Her job was to teach the children in front of her. Ellen understood the rule immediately: stop asking or stop teaching. Undeterred, Ellen's investigation turned forensic. She wrote letters to the Methodist congregations supposedly hosting the Cedar Creek children. The replies trickled back. Polite, confused, uniform. They had no record of these children. No educational exchange. The addresses, the churches, the host families, they were ghosts. Simultaneously, she pieced together the program's financial shadow. As a preacher's daughter, she knew church finances. What she saw made no sense. Large, unlabeled cash deposits. Massive travel reimbursements. Money flowed to vague shipping accounts. The cash increased as the class size shrank. The numbers told a story of massive covert liquidity. Then she observed the conspirators themselves. Margaret Wilson, on a teacher's stipend, was buying land in California. Sarah Coleman could afford extended private treatment in Chicago. Robert Hayes's empire was expanding at a dizzying rate. In a town of miners, they were living like royalty. Their wealth grew with every empty desk. The final piece fell into place in the church basement. After a service, Ellen lingered. She heard the hushed, urgent voices of Wilson and Hayes. Their conversation wasn't about scripture. It was about schedules and risk. She heard the Chicago contact. She heard price per unit. Then clearly one word: shipment. Hayes said, "The final batch must go before the spring thaw." They weren't discussing students. They were discussing inventory. A timeline. On the night of March 15, 1878, Ellen Hartwell stood alone, holding the church key. She knew what she had heard. She knew the addresses were fake. She knew the numbers didn't add up. But knowing wasn't enough. To stop the machine, she needed its blueprints. She needed to get inside its heart. The walk to the church in the dead of night was a journey through a silent, complicit town. Every dark window felt like a blind eye. The beautiful limestone monument loomed against the sky. It was no longer a house of God. It was a fortress. Her key turned in the lock with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. Inside, the cavernous sanctuary was a landscape of shadows. The familiar rooms were alien, threatening. She went straight to Margaret Wilson's private office. This was a surgical strike. She ignored the desk drawers. The most damning evidence is never in plain sight. It is hidden in the structure itself. Her fingers found it near the heavy oak desk. A single floorboard, slightly less worn. It yielded to her letter opener with a soft sigh. In the cavity beneath there was no dust. Only a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Waiting. She lifted it out, her hands steady with a terrible clarity. She unwrapped the bundle on Wilson's own desk. Inside were 3 items. A thick, leather-bound ledger. A bundle of letters. A cloth-covered journal. She opened the ledger first. The columns were neat, the handwriting precise. The names were familiar. Timothy Morrison. Mary Catherine Phillips. Dozens more. Next to each was an age, a description, and a sum of money. This was not an attendance record. It was a sales ledger. Each child was a line item. Each had been assigned a market value and a destination. The numbers were monstrous. They represented the price of a stolen childhood, paid in full. The ledger was a confession written in the blood of innocence. The bundled letters were the forged correspondence. Page after page in Sarah Coleman's meticulous hand, mimicking a child's script, filled with false cheer. They were the weapons that had silenced parental hearts. To hold them was to feel the calculated evil of the lie. Finally, she opened the small journal. Sarah Coleman's private record. Here, financial calculation gave way to psychological dissection. Notes on breaking a child's will. Strategies for replacing family love with devotional fear. It was a manual for soul murder. Ellen Hartwell sat in the villain's chair, surrounded by proof. The scale was paralyzing. But one truth became blazingly clear. The ledger was not complete. Blank lines waited at the bottom of the last page. The dates corresponded with the upcoming excursion. The final batch was still on the schedule. She carefully rewrapped the oilcloth bundle. She placed it back in its hiding place. She smoothed the floorboard. The church had to believe its secrets were still safe. She now carried the horrific truth in her mind. She had the map to the graveyard. And she knew she had to act not like a whistleblower, but like a general. The conspiracy had a timeline. Now so did she. The ledger wasn't finished. And neither were they. Ellen Hartwell sat in the silent darkness of Margaret Wilson's office, the ledger open before her. The columns were not just numbers and names. Physical description, temperament, a price and a destination. This was the true scripture of Cedar Creek's First Methodist Church. The first page held the earliest transactions. Timothy Morrison, age 8, sturdy, docile, $85. Chicago textile interests. The euphemism was clinical. Textile interests meant a grim factory where small fingers were ideal for threading looms. His $85 price tag was for the months they could extract before he broke. Mary Catherine Phillips, age 10, intelligent, compliant. $120. Louisville Domestic Services. The premium was for her education and demeanor. Domestic service was a flexible term in the ledgers of the underground. For a girl like Mary Catherine, it rarely meant legitimate housework. It meant something the ledger did not dare spell out. The ledger was organized by type, like a livestock registry. Younger boys valued for stamina were grouped together. John Miller, 9, resilient, $80. Indiana coal breaker. Thomas O'Brien, 10, strong, $90. Cincinnati machine shop. Their destinations were places of deafening noise and constant danger. Their childhood was harvested for industrial fuel. The entries for girls formed their own chilling category. Eleanor Shaw, 12, pleasant, literate, $115. St. Louis placement. Annette Bauer, 13, meek, $110. Chicago establishment. The language grew more vague as the implied horror grew. Placement. Establishment. They were sentences with no appeal. As Ellen turned the pages, the entries evolved. The sums grew larger. The network's confidence had increased. Later pages included codes next to the prices: D for docile, R for resilient, L for literate. The children were being graded like produce. A child marked with an X had been returned, a faulty product, and a reduced price was negotiated for their resale. The financial summary at the back was its own kind of horror. The documented total exceeded $4,000. In 1878, this was a staggering fortune. It was a lifetime of wages condensed into receipts. Notes in the margin hinted this was just the recorded revenue. References to off-book arrangements suggested the real profit was likely double or triple. This was not a side hustle. It was a thriving enterprise. The ledger showed meticulous reinvestment. Portions of the profits were marked for church improvements and network fees. The crime was funding its own expansion, using the money from sold children to build a more convincing facade. Alongside the ledger, Ellen found the bundle of forged letters. She untied the ribbon. Each was a masterpiece of cruel fiction. Written in Sarah Coleman's steady hand, they mimicked the uneven script of a child. "Dear Mama, I am learning so much. The family here is very kind. Do not worry for me." They were dated months apart, creating a false timeline of happiness. The letters were psychological weapons. If a mother grew too restless, a letter would appear full of specific, comforting details, mention of a favorite food, a recalled memory, information Sarah had gathered in her pastoral chats. The lie was personalized, making it impossible to refute. But the most devastating items were not the forgeries. They were the originals. A small packet of crumpled, hidden notes intercepted before they could be sent. A scrap of paper in a child's shaky hand. "Mama, they told me you didn't want me anymore because I was bad. I work in the big building with the loud machines. My hands hurt all the time. Please come get me." It was unsigned, but an address in Chicago was scribbled on the back. Another, on the torn margin of a newspaper, "The lady here says I have to be grateful, but she makes me do things that feel wrong. I remember what you taught me about right and wrong, but she says God wants me to obey. I'm scared." Ellen recognized the handwriting. It was Mary Catherine Phillips. These were records of a soul being dismantled. Then Ellen opened Sarah Coleman's personal journal. This was the engine room. Page after page contained not financial figures, but psychological profiles. Sarah had chronicled her interactions with each child with the detached curiosity of a biologist. Her notes were chillingly precise. Subject: Anna K. Responds well to praise, vulnerable to guilt. Use religious framework to associate disobedience with sin. Sever homesickness by reframing family as worldly distraction. Another entry, subject: David L. Stubborn pride. Must break through humiliation first. Assign impossible tasks, then offer comfort as sole source of relief. This was the true face of the gentle woman. She was a master of coercive control. She wrote of conditioning periods and attachment transfer. Her goal was not just to sell a child, but to deliver a compliant commodity, one who would not run, fight, or tell their story. The journal also revealed the network's staggering scale. Sarah recorded correspondence with contacts in over a dozen cities. She referenced the Chicago Ring, the Louisville Pipeline. Cedar Creek was a single node in a vast, interconnected web that spanned the Midwest. No child was ever more than one train ride away from disappearance. A series of entries detailed the careful cultivation of Robert Hayes's role. His legitimate business was the perfect cover. Shipments of educational materials could move children. His grain cars could transport them across state lines. His relationships with railroad officials ensured no tickets were recorded, no questions were asked. His wealth didn't just fund the operation, it armored it. The final pages contained the escape plan. It was titled, bluntly, Conclusion. Margaret Wilson had purchased land in California under an assumed name. Robert Hayes had been quietly liquidating his assets. Sarah herself was to depart for Chicago to oversee the final transaction, the coordinated sale of the 23 children on the upcoming excursion. The timeline was explicit. The spring excursion was not an educational trip. It was a liquidation event. The children would be dispersed to buyers in multiple cities in a single coordinated wave. The proceeds would be collected, and the three conspirators would board separate trains west, disappearing into new identities. Ellen now understood the full truth. The disappearances were the output of a corporation, with departments for procurement, processing, and logistics. It was about to execute its largest earnings report before dissolving entirely. The weight of the evidence was physical. She had proof of a multi-state trafficking ring operating from a church basement. But holding the proof was not the same as wielding it. If she triggered it wrong, the conspirators would vanish and 23 more names would be added to the ledger. Her immediate instinct was to run to the local sheriff, Thomas Bradley. But the journal contained a damning aside. Sarah had noted his cooperation, after Robert Hayes forgave a substantial debt. The sheriff was not a potential ally, he was a protected asset. The church hierarchy was equally compromised. The journal noted which board members had received donations from Hayes's mysterious windfalls. The entire power structure of Cedar Creek was either invested in the secret or indebted to it. There was no safe authority left to tell. Ellen was alone. A 24-year-old substitute teacher against a network with money, influence, and a head start. The evidence was her only weapon, but it was also a target on her back. If Wilson or Hayes discovered the ledger had been found, Ellen herself would become a liability. She made her decision there in the dark. She could not wait. The final excursion was mere days away. She needed to get the evidence to someone with real power, someone outside Hayes' sphere of influence. There was one name she knew, Judge William Marshall. He presided over the circuit court in Noblesville, the county seat. He was known as stern, independent, and hostile to corruption. He was 30 miles away. 30 miles of dark, muddy roads on a borrowed horse. It was a desperate gamble. If she was wrong about him, she was finished. But the alternative was unthinkable. To do nothing was to sit in this office and mentally write 23 new entries in the ledger. She rewrapped the oilcloth bundle. This time she did not return it to its hiding place. She slipped it into her bag. She was taking the war to them. She blew out her lamp and slipped from the office. Her absence was the first alarm. She had maybe until morning. The race was not tomorrow. It was now. Ellen Hartwell walked out of the church not as a teacher, but as a fugitive carrying a town's darkest secret. She went straight to the livery stable, waking the owner with a handful of coins, her entire savings. She demanded his fastest horse. He saw the wild, determined look in her eyes and asked no questions. Minutes later, she was on the road to Noblesville, the oilcloth bundle secured under her cloak. The night was pitch black, the road a ribbon of mud. Every shadow could be an ambush. Every sound from behind could be pursuit. Her mind replayed the ledger entries. Timothy Morrison, $85. Mary Catherine Phillips, $120. 23 more names, still unwritten. Her desperate ride was a journey through the conscience of a state. She was carrying the proof that the promised land of industry and progress had a hidden cost, paid in the souls of its children. She was gambling her life on the character of a judge she had never met. The clock was pounding in her ears with every stride of the horse. The ledger was no longer hidden, and someone was finally carrying it into the light. The horse stumbled into Noblesville just before dawn, lathered in sweat and exhaustion. Ellen Hartwell, covered in mud and shaking with cold, went straight to the courthouse. She demanded to see Judge William Marshall, presenting the oilcloth bundle as her only credential. When a clerk tried to turn her away, her voice cut through the morning quiet. 50 children, she said. Tell him 50 children are on the ledger. Judge Marshall was a man built of granite and old law books. He listened in silence as Ellen spread the evidence across his desk. The ledger. The forged letters. Sarah Coleman's journal. His face grew darker with each page. When she finished, he asked only one question. When is the next excursion? She told him, 3 days. He stood, moved to his office door, and called for his clerk. Send telegrams. Now. The telegrams did not go to the Cedar Creek sheriff. They went to police chiefs in Chicago, Louisville, and St. Louis. They went to federal marshals and railroad detectives. They contained names, addresses, and coded phrases from the ledger. Judge Marshall was bypassing the entire corrupted local system. He was triggering a regional collapse. By nightfall, lawmen in 3 states were moving on addresses where children were known to be held. The coordinated raids happened in the gray hour before sunrise on March 29th. In a Chicago textile mill, police found 7 boys, including Timothy Morrison, sleeping on rags between the deafening looms. Their hands were scarred, their hearing damaged. They did not celebrate their rescue. They cowered, conditioned to expect punishment. In a Louisville boarding house masquerading as an employment agency, they found 3 girls. Mary Catherine Phillips was not among them. In total, 11 children were pulled from the darkness that day. 11 names reclaimed from the ledger. It was a victory, but a desperately small one. For every child found, the ledger showed 3 more who were not. Back in Cedar Creek, panic was setting in. The conspirators felt the net closing. Their Chicago contacts had gone silent. A railroad detective had asked questions about recent freight. Margaret Wilson made the decision. They would leave immediately. They gathered their portable wealth and prepared to board the westbound express under assumed names. But Judge Marshall's telegrams had also gone to the station master. When Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes approached the ticket window at the Cedar Creek Depot on the evening of March 30th, they were not met by a clerk. They were met by a U.S. Marshal and 2 state policemen. Hayes reached for a concealed pistol. It was knocked from his hand. They were taken in silence, in front of a stunned crowd of their own neighbors. The town's pillars were led away in shackles. The arrest sent a seismic shock through Cedar Creek. The disbelief was immediate, then violent. Some denounced Ellen Hartwell as a liar, a hysterical woman destroying the town's good name. Others turned on the arrested with a fury born of betrayed trust. The community fractured along the fault line of the truth. The trials that followed were a national spectacle. The ledger was entered into evidence. Rescued children, coached by patient officials, gave halting, devastating testimony. They spoke of endless work, of hunger, of beatings for speaking their native language. The courtroom wept. The jury took less than an hour to convict on all counts. The final tally was a monument to loss. 50 children taken from Cedar Creek. Only 18 ever located and returned. Their homecomings were not joyous reunions, but painful reckonings. They were strangers to their families, carrying traumas their parents could not understand. At least 12 were confirmed dead, victims of industrial accidents, disease, or abuse that was never investigated. The other 20? They remained entries in a ledger. Vanished into the vast, anonymous machinery of a growing nation. No graves, no records, no justice. They were the permanent cost. The sentences felt hollow. Margaret Wilson received 20 years. She died in the state penitentiary just 6 years later of pneumonia, leaving behind no confession, no remorse. Sarah Coleman, whose psychological manipulation was harder to prosecute, was given 15 years. She was released early due to failing health in 1885 and disappeared entirely. Robert Hayes, whose money and influence had built the system, served 12 years. Upon his release, he used hidden assets to travel west. He died in 1903 in a comfortable Los Angeles bungalow, under the name John Harris. He was buried with a headstone that made no mention of Indiana or children or Cedar Creek. The institutional response was a quieter crime. The Methodist Church hierarchy did not launch an internal investigation. It issued a statement of profound regret and distance, calling the conspirators rogue actors who had hijacked the church's good works. Donations dipped briefly, then recovered. No systemic reforms were implemented. The institution protected itself and its future. The town of Cedar Creek was cursed by the truth. Its reputation was poison. Businesses closed. Families who had lost children moved away, unable to bear the sight of the limestone church. Those who stayed cultivated a collective amnesia. The story was not passed down, it was buried. The town's name became synonymous with the scandal, and then, with time, was simply forgotten. And Ellen Hartwell? The hero was treated as a contagion. She was shunned in the streets. Parents who had thanked her for teaching their children now crossed the road to avoid her. Her teaching career was over. No school in Indiana would hire the woman who had exposed Cedar Creek. She moved from town to town, taking short-term positions, always leaving before the story could catch up to her. She never married. The experience had made her profoundly distrustful of institutions and the comforting lies they told. She spent her life advocating for child welfare reforms to deaf ears. She lived with the faces of the 32 children she could not save. Her courage was her sentence. The legacy of Cedar Creek is not in the courtroom verdicts. It is in the uncomfortable pattern it reveals. The conspirators were not monsters from a fairy tale. They were ordinary people. A respected teacher. A gentle assistant. A charitable businessman. Their evil was not radical, it was incremental. It was fueled by greed, enabled by trust, and protected by the universal human desire to believe the best about those in authority. The town was not full of evil people. It was full of good people who chose comfort over courage. Who believed the beautiful lie because the truth was too terrible to hold. Who saw empty desks and called it progress. Their silence was not consent to the crime, it was the oxygen that allowed it to breathe. This is why the story echoes. The technology has changed. The methods are more sophisticated. But the vulnerabilities remain identical. Economic desperation. Parental hope. Blind faith in institutions. The crushing pressure to not make a fuss. The Cedar Creek machine did not need genius to operate. It needed these very ordinary things. Ellen Hartwell's ride in the dark is the counterweight. It is the proof that one person, armed only with evidence and a stubborn conscience, can rupture a system. But her life after is the warning. Society rarely rewards those who tear down its comforting illusions. The cost of truth is often borne alone, so we are left with the questions that matter. Look at your own community. Look at its most respected institutions. What is never discussed? What stories are too good to question? Where is the gratitude so overwhelming it silences doubt? The ledger from Cedar Creek is closed, but ledgers are still being written. In boardrooms, in shelters, in hidden corners of the internet, people are still reduced to codes and values. The calculation is the same. Only the ink is different. Vigilance is not a moment of heroism. It is a habit of skepticism. It is the willingness to be the inconvenient person, to ask for the receipt, to check the address, to notice when the story is too perfect. It is understanding that the greatest evil rarely announces itself with a scream. It arrives with a smile, offering a miracle. Ellen Hartwell's story ends not with a victory, but with a challenge she paid for with the rest of her life. The children of Cedar Creek are not coming back. But the next 23 are still out there, somewhere, waiting to be chosen. The only question that remains is who, today, is willing to make that midnight ride. This is not ancient history. If this story sat with you, if it made you look at your world differently, then you felt its purpose. Share it with someone who understands that history is not just about the past. It is a mirror. And sometimes, the reflection is the most terrifying thing of all. What do you see when you look? Could this happen again? More importantly, could it be happening right now, in the blind spot of your own trust? The discussion is how we keep the ledger closed. Your attention is the first act of vigilance. Don't look away.